Chapter 10. Missing Supplies. Thorax took his leave of Twilight not long after successfully casting the signal flare spell. He had been briefly concerned about it drawing attention, but Twilight had assured him that the flares they had set off had been small enough and close enough to the ground to not attract any undesired attention. She had then made him recite the process for casting the spell from memory before letting him go.
"You have to have it down perfectly,"
were her exact words when he had complained that it seemed unnecessary. But mercifully, she had let him go after that, and he began his return trip to the hive. All the way, he couldn't stop grinning to himself. Were he going on hoof, there would be a very pronounced spring in his step.
"Twilight said she's my friend,"
he thought to himself, barely able to keep himself from cheering at the cold night sky.
"I have a friend! This is wonderful!"
He kept himself from cheering, but a few giddy giggles did slip past his lips from time to time. It was just such an amazing feeling. He'd sucked up the love of many creatures in his time, most of which had been held in changeling cocoons, rendered catatonic and incapable of feeling the emotions naturally. It made them easy to feed on, but the emotions were often hollow and barely sustaining. But the affection he was receiving from Twilight? It was staggering. Not only did it taste magnificent, but it was actually enough to decrease the perpetual ache he felt in his belly. It wasn't enough to totally sate his hunger. Nothing could ever truly satisfy the ravenous appetite of a changeling after all, but it did make it less painful. It also filled his chest with this warm, bubbly feeling that he never wanted to lose. After some time, the hive finally came into sight. Thorax forced himself to flatten his expression and subdue his jubilation. He could celebrate once he was somewhere private, but if he acted too happy around the other drones, it would only draw unwanted attention.
"Just go in, report to Pharynx, get to an empty sleeping chamber,"
he told himself. A balcony emerged in the wall of the hive as he approached, permitting him to come to a landing. Passing through a hole in the wall, he found himself on the edge of a long corridor with many other tunnels branching off of it in every direction. Up, down, left, right, forward, and everywhere in between. One or two other drones were standing around, chatting quietly amongst themselves. They gave Thorax a bored glance before resuming their hushed, chittering discussion.
Excuse me,"
he called out to them, approaching slowly.
"I need to report to Pharynx. Do either of you know where he is?"
One of the drones, a female, turned to give him an impatient scowl.
"Why are you asking us, pacifist?"
she asked. Thorax flinched from the bitterness in her voice.
Because I've been on Lone Wolf Patrol all night and don't know where he is?"
"Then try looking in the warrior's nest," the other drone, a male, bit back. "And stop wasting our time." Thorax shrank back, his ears folding down.
"Right. Sorry." "Pathetic whelp,"
the female hissed under her breath as he made his way further down the tunnel. The insult stung far more than he was used to, making his expression twist into a pained grimace. The walls parted around him, allowing him to walk in more or less a straight line for the warrior's nest. There weren't very many changelings out and about right now, mostly guards dressed in beetle-themed dark blue armor. They barely gave him a passing glance whenever they met, but he could see the disapproving glares hidden behind their stoic expressions. His arrival at his destination couldn't come soon enough. The wall opened in front of him, and he was greeted to the same towering chamber where he had found Pharynx before. This time, the chamber was quiet. A few guards were stationed around, some of them standing on the walls or ceiling to get a better look at things, but for the most part, all was quiet. An uneasy feeling formed in the pit of Thorax's gut. Someone was watching him. He didn't know who, but he could feel the eyes boring into him from somewhere in this chamber. Nevertheless, he had to report to Pharynx on time or face serious consequences. He was already almost late. Taking a deep breath, Thorax leapt from his perch and gently lowered himself down to the ground, passing a few of the chambers in the walls on the way. He glanced in each one for any sign of Pharynx, but only found regular drones. All the while, that feeling of being watched continued to grow worse. When he finally touched down on the floor of the chamber, his observers decided to make themselves known.
Well, well, look who finally came back home.
The sneering voice of Scorpion came from behind Thorax. Yelping, Thorax spun around to see both Scorpion and Mandible staring at him, emerging from their own little hole in the wall with narrowed eyes and hateful frowns. Thorax took a few uneasy steps back, a lump forming in his throat. Were they onto him? Did they know about Twilight?
Well, yeah, of course I'm back.
He stammered out, struggling to keep his eyes focused on the advancing pair of much stronger drones.
I'm supposed to report to Pharynx. I'm back from patrol.
Scorpion scoffed.
You've been taking an awful lot of those solo patrols recently, you know that?
He pointed out skeptically.
Out of nowhere, too. Mandible and I can't help but wonder why. Are you up to something, you little worm?
Thorax tried to stand his ground, but their contemptuous glares broke down his resolve with ease. Letting out a withering whimper, he shrank down and looked at the floor.
I'm just trying to pull my weight,
he mumbled quietly. Mandible harumphed in annoyance.
Pulling your own weight? And why the sudden change of heart? Because that worm almost ate my brother!
Thorax finally shot back, his wings snapping out in a display of aggression.
And I basically didn't do a thing! I almost sat there and watched my only family being eaten alive by a monster, and when I did do something, I ran! I can't keep doing that!
Scorpion suddenly advanced, cutting any further words from Thorax into pieces. Scorpion towered over him, their muzzles mere inches apart, the larger drone's contemptuous glare drilling into Thorax's fearful face and silencing any confidence he had built up. Scorpion's lips peeled back into a malevolent grin, revealing his sharp fangs.
Oh, what's this? Finally got a backbone, little whelp? Or is that just a load of bark you've been rehearsing on your patrols?
Thorax cowered back, his belly pressing into the dirt. His words failed him, and inwardly he cursed himself for being such a sniveling coward. Shame and embarrassment flooded his system, and he looked down at the ground with a defeated chitter. Mandible shook his head in mock disappointment.
All bark, then. I don't know, Mandible,
Scorpion said slowly, lifting a hoof and driving it down hard between Thorax's wings.
Maybe this crippled pup just needs some incentive to start biting.
Thorax gasped, his eyes flying wide as the air was driven from his lungs. He squirmed under Scorpion's hoof, struggling for any purchase so he could stand up and defend himself. He opened his mouth to protest, to cry out, to ask them to stop, but all that came out of him was a breathless wheeze.
What's wrong, Thorax?
Scorpion demanded in a low, cold growl. He twisted his hoof this way and that, grinding it harder into Thorax's spine.
Aren't you gonna defend yourself? Come on, show us some backbone. Show us some bite. That is enough!
In a heartbeat, Scorpion's hoof left Thorax's back, the tall drone backpedaling and standing at attention beside Mandible. A second later, another changeling slammed into the ground in front of Thorax with enough force to kick up a cloud of dust. Thorax screwed his eyes shut while struggling to catch his breath, the dust sending him into a coughing fit. When he opened his eyes again, the dust had cleared, and Pharynx stood protectively in front of him, his purple eyes narrowed with disgust.
Both of you, get out of my sight this instant, and maybe I'll be nice when I report this incident to the Queen.
Like magic, Scorpion and Mandible turned and fled, though not before the former shot Thorax one more glare. The two vanished through a hole in the wall that closed behind them with a spine-chilling scrape of stone on stone. Pharynx maintained his defensive stance for several seconds before turning to glare down at Thorax himself.
That was a pathetic showing of self-defense, brother,
he scolded. Thorax looked down in shame, forcing himself to sit up on his haunches.
I'm sorry,
he mumbled quietly, unable to look his brother in the eye. A hoof roughly thumped him in the shoulder, making him wince.
Don't be sorry,
Pharynx chastised him.
Be better. Now report.
Thorax straightened up to stand at attention.
Patrol went as planned. I passed over the ruins of that wagon I reported to you last time. Local wildlife seems to have picked it clean, sir. Other than that, nothing of note.
Pharynx hummed to himself for a moment before nodding.
Very well. At ease.
Thorax relaxed, letting off a quiet sigh.
There's something else I need to talk to you about.
Pharynx went on in a quieter voice, one that put Thorax on edge. Pharynx put a hoof on his shoulder and guided him to a secluded corner of the room. The lump in his throat came back with a vengeance. Thorax swallowed heavily in an effort to force it down, but it remained stubbornly in place. What could Pharynx want to talk about? He almost never used that tone of voice unless there was something serious going on. Once they were tucked away, Thorax finally managed to find his voice.
What is it, Pharynx? Is something wrong?
He asked quietly. Pharynx nodded before lifting a hoof up to his lips to indicate they should be quiet.
Yes. We have a problem. Supplies kept in the hive's communal storage have been going missing of late. Small amounts, but enough to be noticeable. It's causing some concern among the quartermasters. There's suspicion of a thief hiding somewhere nearby.
Thorax's ears drooped, a surge of guilt swelling within his chest.
There is a thief. It's me,
he thought to himself. He had been sneaking into the hive's storage to bring Twilight food and supplies ever since he found out she had stomach rot. It was a far more reliable method of helping her than scavenging in the wasteland, at any rate. But it left him with the knowledge that he was in danger of far more than just being discovered consorting with an intruder. The guilt he felt at stealing from his own kind was intense. More than once, he had tried to convince himself to stop, to just scavenge what he needed from the desert. He had never managed to convince himself, though. Twilight practically depended on him to bring her food and medicine. If he stopped doing that, her odds of surviving would drop dramatically.
Thorax, pay attention! This is serious!
Pharynx's voice suddenly cut through Thorax's guilt-ridden ruminations, along with a sharp smack to the side of the head.
Ow!
Thorax protested before nodding along.
Sorry. What did you say?
Pharynx snarled angrily, but was quick to compose himself.
I was trying to ask you if you knew anything about it,
he said after a moment, his eyes staring deeply into those of his little brother. Thorax swallowed heavily. The way Pharynx had said that, it was as if he already knew the answer. It was a tone Pharynx only ever used when he was absolutely certain he had figured something out and was just waiting for the confirmation. Thorax had seen it in play numerous times when his big brother dealt with insubordinate drones. to be on the receiving end. He cowered back.
No. I'm sorry, I don't.
He lied, hoping against hope that his words were convincing. He couldn't afford to let Twilight down now, no matter how much it hurt him to lie to his own family like this. Pharynx stared back at him for what felt like forever, his eyes narrowed with scrutiny. Then, with a slow nod, he took a step back. "Very well," he said simply. Thorax blinked.
Huh?
He asked before he could stop himself. Pharynx turned away from him. "Very well. I believe you," came the simple response. "But keep your eyes open and report anything suspicious." And he looked back at Thorax over his shoulder. His eyes had softened, a worried frown on his face. "Be careful, brother." Without waiting for Thorax to respond, Pharynx's wings spread out and took him into the air. Thorax watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest and his mind reeling with a mixture of confusion, relief, and terror. He had never seen Pharynx do that before, not any time he had cornered a drone about a suspected crime. A few seconds later, it clicked. Pharynx had given him the opportunity to lie, and when he did, Pharynx had accepted it and chose not to punish him. He must have been giving Thorax a chance to stomp on his own and spare him Chrysalis's judgment. As his elder broodmate disappeared through a hole in the wall, Thorax swallowed the lump in his throat and backed up through one of his own.
I'm so sorry, Pharynx,
he thought to himself in shame. He decided, then and there, that he would not steal from the hive again, not unless he was left with absolutely no other choice. He stepped out of the warrior's nest, and the hole closed up behind him.